Another day, another recap. I have a banger of a movie for you today. This crime-action thriller movie titled Contraband will take you out of your seats. With that, enjoy the recap. The movie kicks off with a chopper roaming through the skies radioing some officers on boats who receive the all-clear to search a vessel approaching the dock. Andy quickly spots this and wakes up his friend Walter, yelling at him to grab the stuff. Andy grabs the duffel bag with the drugs inside and chucks it overboard as the police approach him. Elsewhere in New Orleans, Chris Faraday is at a wedding for his good friend Danny. Later into the wedding, we are introduced to Chris's wife Kate and his other friend that goes by Sebastian. The crew speaks about Chris's past and how he was the best smuggler in all of New Orleans. When Chris goes to reload, a man named Church approaches him and asks him how he's been. He continues by asking Chris about his work and what he's up to these days. Chris tells him he owns a company that installs security alarms and lives a peaceful life in Algiers. It seems that Chris's father was locked up doing the same smuggling operation his son used to do, and that Church was working with his dad. Church offers Chris a ticket back into that life if he ever chooses to. And with that, the scene cuts to both Andy and Walter driving through the dead of night. They are headed towards their boss to tell him they lost the drugs, as they know running away will surely be worse for them. A car eventually pulls up next to the duo, and the boss Tim Briggs listens to what happened to his supply. Hearing what occurred, he walks back to his car and Andy thinks he dodged a bullet. But instead, Tim runs his vehicle into Andy's car. Sometime later, Kate receives a call and says her brother Andy is in trouble. The trio quickly head off to the hospital to find Andy on the bed and Walter in surgery. Chris wants answers and Andy gets straight to the point and tells him he had to drop 10 pounds of coke when customs jumped on him. He apologizes to his sister and Chris has a talk with his man Sebastian to do some reconnaissance about Tim Briggs. On the car ride home, Chris tells Kate he'll sort out her brother's problem and the two go to pick up their kids from the babysitter. The following day, Chris deals with a client when he receives a call. Sebastian gives him information on Briggs about how he was released from prison a couple months ago and where he hangs out. Chris immediately jumps onto the road and makes his way to the hangout. After walking inside, he approaches Briggs, who knows exactly who Chris is. Seems Chris and Briggs' brother used to work together back in the days, and it seems Chris wants to arrange something to stop him from killing Andy. Briggs wants $700,000, which is the full rate of the drugs he lost, and Chris tells him to be reasonable. The man doesn't care about Chris's reputation, and this makes Chris walk off. He makes his way to Andy to see him packing his bags. Turns out Briggs paid Walter a visit last night and ended his life. Chris lectures Andy and makes sure he understands that he had no one telling him right from wrong. But Andy is a senseless moron that chose this life. With that, Chris grabs his pistol and makes his way to Briggs' house. He is met with an unwelcoming demeanor, and Chris tells him he needs 1 month to pay him back. But instead he is given 2 weeks and threatens his family if he doesn't pay up. This causes a small fight to break out between the two, and Chris makes sure Briggs knows never to mention his wife or kids ever again. Briggs' daughter sees this happening and everything settles down. Later on, Chris watches some boats from a distance, and that's the only way he knows how to make that type of money. He goes to his wife and problematically tells her that he has to go back into the smuggling game. His wife is not happy to hear this, but there is no other alternatives. Now it's time to see the repercussions for getting caught in the smuggling game. Chris meets his father and tells him he wants to get back into the game. His father says the best day of his life was when Chris went clean and opened up a proper business. But he understands the need for it and gives his son his position on the cargo ship he used to smuggle things in through. Chris leaves and tells Sebastian the plan. But problematically, Chris refuses to smuggle drugs even though it's the best profit margin. Instead, they resort to buying $15 million in fake US currency in Panama and smuggle it into the US. Chris wants to see the crew manifest and looks through the names to find a crew. In Panama City, Chris calls his man to alert him he's coming to take a massive shipment of cash. The man says he'll be waiting. That night he arrives at the dock with his family. He gives them all a hug and makes his way onto the massive cargo ship. The crew begin arriving onto the ship, and both Andy and Chris set down their bags. The ship takes off and the duo hide some duffel bags inside the wall before making their way to meet the crew. The captain that goes by camp spots Chris and tells his men who let him aboard his ship. He demotes him immediately and wants his men to watch him. Later on, Chris awakens from a power nap and gets back to work cleaning rugs. But in the meantime, he steals a map from the drawer which the captain does not see. With that, he grabs a welder and starts using it on a wall. He eventually heads up to meet his crew that are helping him smuggle the money in. He tells them to not involve the captain, and they follow him downstairs where he shows them a massive hole he made in the wall where he wants to hide the cash. The second in command comes walking down towards them, and they are forced to leave Andy inside and close up the entrance. The second in command walks in and tells the men to not hang around and beat it. After looking around, he doesn't see anything suspicious and leaves the workshop. The crew are then told the plan by Chris. He wants to drive and grab the cash and bring it back to the ship during rush hour. Tariq doesn't believe there is enough time, and Olaf is told to make a small problem with the ship to stall and give them time. Back at home, Chris's family is being watched by Briggs and some of his thugs. Briggs walks up to the front door and tells Kate he wants to play. His other men come into the house and begin destroying the entire place as Kate is pinned down. One of the thugs accidentally fires a bullet, and Briggs tells his men to roll out. At the Panama Canal, the ship is almost about to dock, but Chris helps sabotage the ship. He is then called to the deck to answer a phone call by his wife, who is distressed. He tells her to call Sebastian, who immediately makes his way to the family. The captain tells his men to reduce speed halfway, but Chris's men accidentally sabotage the boat too much and they are headed for the dock at full speed. The captain is going crazy and tells the men to open the anchors. They kill the engine, and Chris releases the anchors as they turn their boat. They have a small crash in the process as the ship stops. The captain heads straight down to Olaf and is told there was a propeller jam. The captain says someone tampered with it and storms off. Chris, in the meantime, makes his way to the duffel bags he hid in the wall, and the captain is told off for his reckless behavior. Danny, Chris, and Andy then quickly make their way through the city, and Chris makes sure his wife and kids are all right. They arrive at their location and walk through a shop to find Edwin in the back. Chris asks if he got the van and cash, and he says he did. Edwin shows the uncut fake American dollars, and Chris examines it. He says something is wrong and tells Andy to wait there. He goes through the shop and grabs a chemical. He places a drop onto the paper, and when it turns blue, he goes off at Edwin saying he didn't print it on starch-free paper. Chris is not happy and says he wanted it the same as last time. He tells his boys let's head off to the warehouse where they made it, but Edwin tells him it's a bad idea. With about an hour left to get back, he goes towards the warehouse, but problematically, the captain is going around the boat looking for him. At Briggs' house, he gets a knock at the door and finds Sebastian there. Sebastian walks in the house and tells him not to touch Chris's family, and that if he'd hired a proper smuggler from the get-go, their package would have arrived safely. Seems Sebastian is quite two-faced, and the scene cuts to the trio scared to meet up with Gonzalo, but Chris reassures them he'll handle it. They arrive at the factory, and Danny and Chris leave the car as Andy listens to a voicemail with Briggs telling him to call him. As the two head inside to meet the boss, Andy answers Briggs, who tells him he wants him to take the real money they have and take it to a specific address over in Panama. If he doesn't bring the package, then his sister and her kids won't make it. Andy then opens the bag with the real money they have, and inside the building, Gonzalo greets his old friend Chris. As Danny goes to grab the van, Gonzalo tells Chris he is taking down an armored truck if he wants to join in. Outside, Danny goes to the van but sees Andy missing. Gonzalo also tells Chris if he joins, he can take the super notes for free. Danny then brings the van inside and tells Chris the money and Andy is missing. Problematically now, Gonzalo and his men aim their guns at Chris, and Gonzalo reckons he has disrespected him. Chris then asks if the offer still stands, the super notes to ride with them. Gonzalo takes the two men's wallets and IDs. Back at the ship, the captain calls Olaf and tells him he has 10 minutes to get the boat ready. He relays this information to Chris and is told to stall as much time as possible. The duo in the van have been instructed to block the armored truck. When they spot the vehicle approaching, they get in the way but are flipped over. Gonzalo's men then come running at the truck and blow it open. Gonzalo kills the 3 guards guarding the shipment, and the crew immediately go to take out the items from the truck. Tariq starts paying off a few people to delay their work, trying to give Chris enough time to grab the super notes. Gonzalo takes a painting out of its framework, and problematically the cops arrive on the scene quite quickly. A shootout immediately takes place, and some heavy reinforcements make their way onto the scene and slaughter Gonzalo's men. Gonzalo kills a few cops, but there is no chance at beating them. The driver of the pickup truck is also killed, and Gonzalo is the last man standing. He jumps into the truck and both Danny and Chris hop on the back. Gonzalo is grazed by a bullet and a chase ensues until a bus blocks the cop's path. Andy makes his way back onto the boat and Tariq asks where the others are. Seems the others have managed to avoid the cops, and Chris throws the painting into his van, and when they go to grab their IDs, Gonzalo tells them to take him to the hospital. They put him in their van as the cops approach the building. As they speed off, Gonzalo dies, and Danny retrieves their wallets and chucks Gonzalo out. Tariq is called by Captain Camp, who wants him on board and also tells his men to search anyone walking on the ship. Chris goes flying in the dock, and Tariq opens a container for them to drive the van into. But as Tariq is closing the container, the crane yanks it up and the doors remain open. Danny goes to close the doors and does so as the container is placed down. Tariq rushes to the duo, who begin unloading the super notes. Simultaneously, Customs tell Captain Camp they want him to check the containers that came in late. The men trolley away the super notes, and Captain Camp begins looking at the late containers to see if anything is out of the ordinary. Tariq and Danny begin loading the money into the hole Chris created. Chris, meanwhile, sees Captain Camp and begins doing some parkour to get away from them. He escapes as the captain opens the last container. They find nothing out of the ordinary, and Chris goes back to the room and bashes the hell out of Andy and asks where his money is, when he is told that he bought drugs with it and it's in the roof. Chris begins throwing the drugs at Andy until he is shown the voicemail Briggs threatened him with. Chris relaxes a bit and calls Kate to make sure everything is okay. Sebastian watches this unfold, and Chris puts the drugs with the super notes. He calls Sebastian and gives him a rundown of what happened and that he is tossing the drugs in the sea. Sebastian then gets a visit from Church, who threatens him and gives him a couple days. He lectures him and makes sure his message is clear as he leaves. Sebastian goes to see Briggs and tells him to threaten Kate so that Chris doesn't throw away his package. Chris begins making some stuff in the kitchen with Tariq, and the scene jumps to Kate finishing her work for the day. Briggs the psycho rams through the glass doors and grabs Kate's head and slams it into glass. He threatens her to make sure her husband brings his package. Sebastian then pulls up and approaches Briggs, who fakes like he doesn't know him and drives off. Sebastian hugs Kate and she smells some alcohol on him and gets pissed he's driving her kids. She tells them to get out of his car and puts them in her vehicle and takes off. She immediately calls Chris, and when she says Briggs said to not dump it in the water, he realizes something is wrong and the phone cuts out. Kate is with her friend, who is really concerned for her, and her friend says the cops want to speak to her. Kate goes back to Sebastian's house, and Chris finds out from Andy that he got the drugs from a man named Ruben, which Chris knows quite well. At Sebastian's house, Kate walks inside and sees him asleep and packs her belongings. He wakes up and tells her to stay the night, but when she refuses and slaps him, he chases her, and she locks herself in her room. She calls Chris, and Sebastian smacks the door open, which causes Kate to fall and hit the back of her head. Chris calls back, and Sebastian knows he messed up bad. Chris calls Sebastian's phone and tells him that if he steps near his family, he is a dead man. Sebastian calls Captain Camp and tells him that Chris is going to dump a package, and if he makes sure he doesn't, the captain can have Chris's share of profits. He agrees, but also says if he doesn't give up its location, he's going to call in the dogs and get the package seized. With that, the captain heads down to Chris's room and begins searching the place. When Chris doesn't give up the package, the captain tells him that he is getting locked up when Customs and Border Protection finds it. Chris sneaks his way into the captain's quarters and steals some keys. Customs and Border Protection are then alerted by the captain, and now it gets really serious. Chris cuts a copy of the captain's keys, and the CBP make their way towards the boat in full force. The units get deployed, and there are many, and I mean many, cops ready to search the ship. Sebastian grabs some plastic to wrap Kate's lifeless body inside. He covers her up, and the police all board the ship as the crew are put into one area. Customs search the ceiling and quickly discover the hole in the wall that is empty. They also search the van and only find a tarp. Chris is taken into interrogation, and Andy walks off the boat and is given the all clear. Problematically, Briggs spots Andy, who makes a run for it and gets cornered quite easily. In interrogation, Customs tell Chris that the man who is bringing in the container with the van has been dead for years. Chris acts dumb and they can do nothing to him and let him go. Chris sees Briggs in the car, who is holding Andy captive. But when Briggs doesn't see his drugs, he closes the window and Chris breaks it and yanks him from the car. He starts belting the pulp out of him until a thug fires a shot. Chris is taken into the car and gives Briggs the direction to find his package. He uses the key he created to open a house, and a silent security alarm triggers police to go to the address. Inside the house, Chris pops open the trunk of a car to reveal his cleaning machine. He takes it apart and starts handing Briggs the drugs. They know now that Chris is a master smuggler, and they test out the gear. Using this distraction, Chris hijacks a car and drives away as Captain Camp makes his way downstairs to find Briggs and his men inside his house. The cops pull up to the house, and Briggs as well as Captain Camp are arrested. Chris rocks up to his house and calls for Kate but does not see her there. Sebastian has Kate's dead body in his car and wants to dump it. Chris rocks up at Sebastian's house, and when nobody answers, he tries to break in. Sebastian sits there regretting what he has just done, and Chris discovers the broken lock on the door. Sebastian heads over to his worksite and wants to hide the body in the concrete. Chris pulls up to the worksite as well, and he finds and whacks Sebastian. When he doesn't answer where Kate is, Chris belts him and then walks away to see what Sebastian's men are working on. He calls Kate and hears a phone ringing where the concrete is being poured into. He goes to see a body there and immediately breaks Kate free. He sees her lifeless corpse, and Sebastian just watches. But very fortunately, and I mean very fortunately, Kate was not dead, just unconscious. Tariq and Danny make their way to a specific location, and Chris is finally reunited with his wife. Tariq and Danny then start pulling up the super notes, and now they understand exactly why Chris is the best smuggler in the game. Sebastian gets locked up, and guess who he's in jail with? As the van was being ordered by a dead man, customs listed for auction, Andy manages to buy the van, and Tariq takes his boat to a dock where the entire crew is selling their findings to Church for the luxurious price of $3 million. Church asks Chris if he had anything to do with the painting that was stolen in Panama. When he says no, Church tells him that painting is worth $140 million. And guess what? It's still in the van that Andy just bought, and the crew get in and drive off. The movie comes to an end when we see Kate and Chris on a beach house, clearly indicating that they have upgraded their life to another level. That's the end. Thanks for sticking this far, and I'll see you on the next one.